It's a privilege to be here. I don't know the last time I was in a meeting that I heard such great leadership principles as what you just heard, both in the morning session and also from Alan. It was gold. And so, I hope you're taping all these because, you need to really revisit those so much. A little bit of my background, just so you get to know me a little bit. I'm in my third career. I got saved in 1972 in the Jesus movement when I was in law school at William and Mary. I became an executive with the Family Channel. So I actually ran their offices in New York, Chicago, Detroit, LA, London, and Hong Kong. And when we sold to Murdoch in the late 90s, I was appointed as the president of Middle East Television. And so I lived in and out of Israel for a couple of years. And I did marketing in Tel Aviv. I did politics in Jerusalem. But my operations were in a war zone in South Lebanon. I had 72 employees and 32 were Shiite Muslim guards. And so it really made personnel matters pretty interesting because before you could fire somebody, you had to disarm them. And we'd never used the word terminate. That was not part of our vocabulary. But, this, I want to give you a couple gifts as you leave today back on the table. The book Bulletproof is Business Protection Strategies from the War Zone. And these are things I learned doing business in the war zone in South Lebanon. And interesting, Alan's comments, the first chapter, the name of the chapter is Leadership is Always the Problem, and Leadership is Always the Answer. And so my first day on the job, across the border into the war zone, my head of news, who was also my head of security, put a flak jacket on me, and I sat in the Land Rover, and there was an AK-47 between us, and I put my seatbelt on, and he popped the seatbelt. He said, "We don't wear seatbelts here in case we're attacked." And they said, "Would you like to go meet General Lahad?" I said, "No, I want to go home. What am I doing here?" So General Lahad was the general over the South Lebanese army, and our compound was on his property. And so it was protocol for the president of Middle East Television to go pay respects to General Lahad. And so, and this is all in this first chapter about leadership. Because as I get into legal structuring, it doesn't matter what legal structure we use. If you have a bad actor, they're going to blow it up. Okay, and so watching our hearts, recruiting the right people, addressing problems early on, are in your best interest, and they're in the church's best interest. So I met with General Lahad, and Salam took me there, and he said now, he's going to shake with his left hand instead of his right hand because he's just getting over an assassination attempt. And his wife, who is a beautiful young French lady, she had a personal trainer, and General Lahad came up from his afternoon nap because all of the activity was at night with the Hezbollah. And as he went to greet his wife, the trainer was Hezbollah, and she pulled a gun out of her towel and shot him 3 times point blank. He put his arm up and it went out his arm. So Salam was explaining to me, now I'm so far out of my comfort zone. This is like, are you kidding me? So I'm sitting in the living room, and there's floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains of South Lebanon, and the windows are vibrating because of the shelling going on. And I've got a flak jacket, and I've got an interpreter, and I've got a guy with a gun, and General Lahad walks in, and I'm wondering, what are we going to talk about? Because we're talking about the Hezbollah, we're talking about the war zone that we're in, possibly being overrun by the Hezbollah. The Israeli Defense Force is protecting them, but they might pull out. And I'm thinking, what are we going to talk about? And so, General Lahad sat down, and he looked at me, and in his very gruff voice, he leaned over and he said, "Steve, tell me about Monica Lewinsky." I thought, what? You know? And later on that day, we crossed back across the border, and we met with the generals for the Northern Command because I had to work a protocol to get our people across the border in a meltdown, which happened later, and the protocol worked. And so we're in the middle of the woods in northern Israel in this really romantic, cool farmhouse with it was all stone. It almost seemed like it was like in Europe or something. And there was a barn, and in the bottom of the barn was a four-star restaurant for the commanders and their attachés who were coming off maneuvers. So in come the commanders, and they're just so cool. I mean, they had their uniforms on, they had their hats and their epaulets, and they sat down next to me, and I was sitting next to the general for the Northern Command, and I was there as the president of the Middle East Television to get my people across the border in case they get shot at. And the general looks over at me and he says, "Tell me about Monica Lewinsky." Same question. And what I realized is, our actions have ripple effects far beyond anything we can imagine. And people deserve to be able to depend on their leaders and our leadership principles, our actions, our behavior, because of Clinton's dalliances in the White House in Washington, it was destabilizing the war zone in South Lebanon because General Lahad didn't know whether he was going to start a conflict to get the heat off of himself or not engage because he'd be blamed for having the wrong motives. And so everybody didn't know what the heck our president was going to do. That's just the beginning of the book, okay? But Bulletproof, I learned, that leadership is always the problem and leadership is always the answer. And, just to kind of give a background of what we're doing, I do have the privilege, I'm a complex business lawyer. A subset of that is nonprofits, a subset of that is churches. And I have the privilege of working with churches in all 50 states, as Andy said. Probably we're over, there are thousands of them, and also in Canada. And I think I'm the only attorney in America that's working with all denominations, everybody but the Catholics. They've got their own legal group, and they do what they're going to do. I'm also an ordained pastor, and the reason I'm an ordained pastor is because I wasn't sure I could get into heaven as a lawyer. So I have pastored twice in my career full time. So I feel your pain. I love the local church. But the local church has to understand that the definition of church has changed. And we need to be comfortable with that. So let me just walk you through some realities now, okay? Let's see. So, one of the things, the other gift I want to give you is this handbook called The Business of Church, under 100 pages, Alan. So, my publisher said this is too short of a book, and I said, actually, you don't understand my audience. This is for the pastors, their leaders. I just want to give them touch points of things that really matter that they need to keep their eye on. The title came because I have a friend who's a psychologist. He works with burned out pastors all over America. And when he gives them their intake questionnaire, he asks them, why did you ever get involved in the ministry to begin with? And invariably, the pastors will say, I want to preach the Bible and help people. But the reality is 85% of a pastor's job is business. And what Eric explained to me was that the pastors are not equipped to be able to handle this particular area. They're not being trained in that. Now, some of you have come from a lay background. You're dual occupation, so maybe you have business backgrounds, but it's not coming out of the seminaries. So I'm actually working with Dallas Theological Seminary to create a course called The Business of Church to help the pastors as they come out. But so Eric explained to me that we're not wired to fail in our core responsibilities over a long period of time without some aberrant behavior showing up. And so this whole idea of the business of church, it's not a dirty word to say business and church. There's some secular reporters don't understand the fact that business acumen is actually good stewardship. People are trusting us with their tithes, their offerings, in some cases, generations of tithes and offerings. And you have to be able to steward them properly, and that is business. There are assets under management, as Pastor Allen was sharing with us. I mean, and this is an $8 million project that we're sitting on. Down the road, it's $38 million. I just represented a church that bought a shopping center. And the church is going to be the anchor tenant. There's going to be mixed use. There's all kinds of things that are happening as the church is taking ground in the communities. But the reality is most pastors didn't sign up for this, the idea. And so most of the pastors' time is spent managing the business of church. And I'm concerned about that. And it's something that I want to be a resource with and help, And so I think that the idea of the legal structuring is we've got to think past lunch, that God wants us to think generationally. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he sees generations. And so, the reality is if things are working right now, great, but it's not about you. It's about the next generation. It's about the generations to come. Are we setting them up for a win? And so there's this troubling word called transition. And really it's a kind word for disruption or change. And every family, every business, every church is going to have periods of transition. Alan was just explaining how they had continually are changing the way they do government in the church as the church got bigger. Those are transition moments. Those are tension moments. They're disruptive. And again, we've got to be willing to do that. And so, good succession planning, I believe, is really paying attention to what I call the transition zone. And the best example I can give it to why what I do matters to me, and I hope it matters to the churches that we're working with, is the idea of the handoff. In 2008, I don't know if you guys remember, but, when we sent our athletes over to the relay races in China, we sent the most world-class record holder athletes that ever were assembled for our relay team. And nobody ever questioned whether we were going to win the gold. It's really who's going to come in second, who's going to come in third. But there's an important moment in a relay race, and it's the handoff. It's called the transition zone. And if we're not paying attention to the handoff, then it doesn't matter about your lap, because that's not the point of the race. And, the Bible says first comes the spiritual, the natural, and then comes the spiritual. Right now, the largest transfer of wealth in the history of America is taking place between World War II and the boomers down to the next generation. And that's in the natural. I think the same thing is happening in the spirit, is that we are actually experiencing the largest transfer of wealth of spiritual knowledge, as Billy Graham has gone to heaven, and many of our forefathers have gone that we have grown up with. And now we're stewards. And there's a handoff moment. So this team, even though they were all record holders, did not pay attention in the transition zone. And I don't know if this is I don't know if you can see it or not, but the actual baton is down there. Okay, they dropped the baton during the handoff, and so again, they lost focus in this transition zone. And basically what happened was this men's all-star team was disqualified. They never finished the race because they weren't paying attention to the handoff, And so I think this is important. I don't know about you, but that's not what I want to look like when I see Jesus. It's not going to be good enough to say, well, I took care of my lap, because it wasn't about us, was it? It's about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's about the handoff. And so, I don't really want to. Now, you would think that everybody would be alerted in the 2008 Olympics. We sent the women over, okay? The women were the same record holder, world-class athletes, and they dropped the baton. Same thing happened because they didn't practice or pay attention in the transition zone. And again, they were disqualified. They never finished the race. And again, their destiny was never realized because they weren't paying attention to the handoff. And that's what really the legal structuring of a church is all about. It's not just about who's here right now, but do you have the capacity to be able to grow? Do you have the framework to be able to grow? Do you have the framework where a giver, which we're talking about the metrics of identifying people who have the capacity to give, will they trust that you can take care of the assets that they're going to give you? I was just thinking about the scripture, as you guys were sharing, before me, but it's actually in Haggai 1:6, where he says, this is the New International Version, it says, you've planted much, but you've harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on your clothes, you're not warm. You earn wages, only to put them in a purse with holes in it. Some of our churches are leaking, and we wonder why some of the people who have the capacity to give or invest in what's happening, why maybe they are reticent to do so. And many times it's because they don't see the accountability, the structure that can actually hold the vision that we want to have. And so, again, the good news is the women finally got their act together. And on the later relay, they actually won. And that's the way I want to look when I see Jesus in heaven. I want to say we finished the course, we ran the race, and we ran the whole race and not just our lap. And so, again, it's not unspiritual to know your legal rights. As I work with churches around America, sometimes, some of the old guard says, well, this is carnal. But really, I go back to Acts chapter 22, because, there was a moment when Paul was mighty glad he knew his legal rights. He was stretched out. Remember the story? He was about ready to be beaten. And back then, this was just their method to interrogate the person to find out what they did. And many people never lived through the interrogation. It was such a brutal beating by the Romans just to find out, why is the crowd all mad at you? And so he's stretched out, he's about ready to be beaten, and he turns over his shoulder and he says, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen without a trial? And we all know the story. So that guard went to his superior, they went to their superior, they released him and said, holy cow, what are we doing? So, Paul's ministry was extended because he knew his legal rights. He was going to be martyred, but not then. And I think we're living in a period of extension in America right now, where we can still do everything that God has given us to do. We're still under the protection of our wonderful U.S. Constitution, under the First Amendment to the Constitution. We still have that covering. But it's changing on how we have to accommodate that covering and access that covering. But we need to know our legal rights so that we can actually do what God's called us to do. And so again, God wants us to affirm people. Society wants us to affirm behavior. And so we're in Revelation, where whosoever will come, that's the heart of the church. I want everybody to come in the church, but when we come to Jesus, things change. And there is a standard, and society is pushing against that, and so again, we have to be a lot smarter than we were in the past. And so I think Ephesians 6 is really in the Message Bible, is a great example of where we are. because, when Paul's talking, he's talking about, the fight we're in. He said, God, that about wraps it up. God is strong. He wants us to be strong. So take everything the master has set out for you, well-made weapons of the best material, and put them to use so you'll be able to stand up against everything the devil throws at you. It goes on to say, this is no afternoon athletic contest where we're just going to go home at the end of the day. This is a life or death fight against the devil. And then he goes on to say here, so take all the help you can get, every weapon God has issued. This room is full of weapons that are available. I live in Hampton Roads. It's the headquarters for the Atlantic Fleet in Norfolk. It's the headquarters for Oceana, which is where all the pilots fly out of that are on the aircraft carriers. It's the nuclear stockpile for the East Coast. It's Fort Eustis, which is the logistics for the Army. It's all sitting in my area. So giving a military example of my area is not hard to do. But I did a study once about our special ops guys, and this guy that's on the slide, when I did the study, I realized it costs about $1 million per soldier to equip that guy. And yet, and so just think about the absurdity if this soldier said, well, I really don't want to wear the helmet because, it's heavy and I can't really move the way I like to. Or I don't want to wear the flak jacket because it restricts me. Or I don't want to wear the night vision goggles because the color of green makes me nauseated. I mean, that's absurd. Everything that is on that soldier has been purchased at a very high price to be able to not only help him survive, but actually win the battle. But I think the church has been famous for leaving some equipment on the shelf. And then we take some shots and we actually get wounded where we didn't have to because there was equipment there. And so there's finance equipment here, there's leadership equipment here. I'm just part of the equipment, which is the legal end of things. But it is part of the equipment. And if you leave it on the shelf, you're going to be in Haggai, and you're going to be leaking all over town. And there are going to be consequences you don't have to face. And so, again, one of the things that I think is a demonic attack on pastors is trying to scare us that because of all of the social orientation, sexual orientation stuff, somehow we can't do what God's called us to do. But nothing could be further from the truth. Now our reality has changed out there. The social world has changed. Same-sex marriage is now a civil right. We know that. It didn't take a gift of discernment when Obama's White House was dressed out in a rainbow to understand something has changed, in the landscape of this country. And so I'm regularly asked by churches several predictable questions, and I want to remove fear off of you as you leave here today to let you know you can do what God's called you to do. First of all, am I required to marry same-sex couples? What about holding or conducting same-sex celebrations? Can I refuse to employ a person who is transgender or has a sexual orientation that's different than what we believe theologically? What about volunteers? If a volunteer is transgender or has a sexual orientation that's different than what we believe, do I have to let them, take care of my kids? And what about the use of my facility, which is very interesting. It came up in this particular discussion. What if I'm going to rent out my facility and make it available to the community? What do I do? Well, here's the answers, okay? Are you required to marry a same-sex couple? The answer is no. The First Amendment to the Constitution guarantees us religious freedom. However, the difference between now and 10 years ago is now you have to demonstrate more than ever that you have a sincerely held religious belief. And that's why you're not going to marry that couple. So in the old days, you used to be able to say, I believe the Bible, and that was good enough. Now we have to say, we believe the Bible says this about that. And one of the things I'm working with churches all over America on is updating their statements of faith. And it's not a theological treatise. I create what's called a condensed statement of faith that's going to be used in moments like this. It's going to be used in employment moments. It's going to be used if you're going to actually, rent your facility out. Other than the basic stuff, we believe in the Trinity and salvation of man and the fall of man and redemption of man and all that. Then we get right into marriage. We believe marriage is an institution ordained by God, scripture and verse. It's not a fad. Between one man and one woman, scripture and verse. And now even that has changed since people are identifying. I have a granddaughter in high school right now, and she says she has a classmate who identifies as a lizard. And she has another classmate who identifies as a pony and wears a tail to school. And so now just to have a statement of faith that says, I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, still doesn't go far enough. Because I can say, well, that's okay. I identify as a woman today, so you can marry me and John. Okay, so now what do? So the statements of faith we also have, we believe that, scripturally that God created two distinct genders, male and female, scripture and verse. And so we believe that marriage is an institution. It's modeling the bride of Christ. It's an important part of our theology for the health of our society and the health of our families. We believe it's between a man and a woman. We believe that a person's biological identity at birth is their sex because God created two distinct genders and God does not make mistakes, And so all of that's in the statement of faith, all right? And now it has to be in there because if somebody says you're discriminated against me, you can say, I'm allowed to because we're a church. And the First Amendment of the Constitution actually guarantees religious freedom. But you better be able to show it, that it's not just a fad. It's not an arbitrary kind of drifting thing that kind of everybody kind of understands. Show it to me. So we're putting it, making sure that it's in the bylaws and making sure that it's in an attachment so you can use it over and over again. You don't have to open up the bylaws every time you want to use your statement of faith. So are you required to marry same-sex couples? No. But, either amend and restate your bylaws to make sure that they're updated or incorporate the church if it's not incorporated. Same thing goes with, the idea of celebrating same-sex marriages. What about employment law? Every state has employment law. In Virginia, where I'm from, we have a very aggressive employment law that says you can't discriminate based on sexual orientation, except the First Amendment to the Constitution and Supreme Court decisions that were passed down in 2021 and 22 have affirmed that there is an exemption, a ministerial exemption for churches. And so I can decide I'm going, and there was a huge controversy over that to say, well, does that just mean it only applies to ministers? And they said, no, it's a broad umbrella. It's the organization gets to be under this ministerial exemption. What does that mean? That means I can say to you, here's our statement of faith. If you want to work here, here it is. And you have to agree that you've read it and you affirm it and you're going to abide by it as an employee of this church or of this ministry or of the school or of the preschool or of the daycare, whoever is going to be, associated with the church because it's the ministerial exception. If they can't do that, then you can say, I'm sorry, you can't work here. Now, I don't care what your sexual orientation is if you want to park cars, but if you're going to take care of the nursery, I want to know, do you abide by our statement of faith or not? So again, you can say no to some people and not end up with a Title VII suit on your hands, okay? And the same thing happens, when it talks about volunteers, but I want to get to the facilities. One of the regular things that I provide for churches and that you need to have is what's called a facilities use agreement. The facilities use agreement basically says this facility has been given to us by God in trust for our people and for and you know as a you know from generations of tithes and offerings and for use by our people. It's basically for our members and for our people. However, we do make our facility open to the to the community to show God's love, His interest, His compassion, His generosity to the community. However, if you're going to use our facility, you have to have read our statement of faith and agree that you're not going to advocate a position that would violate our statement of faith in your use of this facility. If you don't do that and you open up your facility to an outside group, without this, you've created what's called a public use. Now you can't say no to anybody. It's a big deal. So I had a church in Philadelphia. They had just remodeled their church. It was all this modern scrubbed wood, cool lighting and everything. And the pastor called me and said, Steve, he said, Lifetime Television wants to rent out our facility because they're doing a documentary on schools and they want to use our church. Can I do that? I said, well, brother, did you do the updated statement of faith I told you about? Uh, no. Do you have a facilities use agreement we talked about? No. Well, if you sign that contract with Lifetime, very lucrative, you've just now created a public use, and now you can't say no to anybody. Well, how fast can I get it? So I got it to them in like an hour. And Lifetime Television signed it. And so they said, we're not going to, I said, so if Lifetime Television is going to do, a workshop on bullying in the schools, that's fine. If they're going to teach kids how to use computers, how to balance a checkbook, that's fine. If they're going to do a track on same-sex parenting, that's not fine. See what I mean? And so that's where you begin to address who's going to use your building and how are they going to use it. 2 weeks later, same pastor called me, Brother Steve. We got these two ladies in the church. They're lesbians. We all know they're lesbians. We love them. We're just so happy they're coming. They have a 501c3 charity, and they want to rent our church. Can they do it? I said, same answer as 2 weeks ago. It depends how they're going to use it. If they're going to teach kids how to use computers, if they're going to teach kids, life skills and everything, that's fine. If they're going to talk about sexual identification, it's not happening. So this facilities use agreement, all of this ties back to your statement of faith. And if you don't have it in writing, it's not a sincerely held religious belief. It's a preference, and it's not covered. You see how it's all feathering together? So we've got to be more intentional than we've ever been, in the way we're going to address these things in our church. So again, the answer is you're not required to marry same-sex couples. You're not required to conduct their renewals. You can refuse to employ somebody if they are of a sexual orientation that violates your statement of faith, as long as you have a statement of faith, and also your facilities. So again, Supreme Court ruling, in 2021, affirmed that it's a protected area, but later on they said this ministerial provision, was available. So that's just 101 to make sure that your current situation is working. Protecting the assets of the church is a huge deal. Again, it's business structuring, and it's not a dirty word. It's stewardship. It's being accountable. It's taking care of people's assets that they have trusted you with to protect the assets of the church. If your church has not been incorporated, you need to run and not walk to get it incorporated. The unincorporated church is the most porous envelope you could possibly have for the organization of a church. The pastor, the elders, the trustees are all personally liable for what happens inside an unincorporated church. Some states have this, charitable immunity doctrine, but it doesn't cover everything. And only a few states even have that. Virginia, we have that. But basically, if you're not incorporated and something bad happens in the church, you've just opened yourself up as the pastor to personal liability. So that's a good starter, okay, of why you don't want to do that. And so again, one of the things, if you are incorporated, one of the things I talk about in my book is beware of the cut and paste mentality. That your current incorporation may not be wrong, it just may not be right. If you've borrowed your documents from a friend, or they were constructed 50 years ago and nobody's touched them since, they may not be working right. And again, it matters for a bank, it matters for stewardship, it matters if there's a legal firefight, that if somebody's claiming, well, that decision was an unauthorized decision because you're not following your bylaws. And all of a sudden you say, well, that's not the way we do church anymore. Well, that's what your bylaws say. And so that's your legal document. And so updating this is a big deal. So again, watch out for just borrowing documents from everybody. I give the example, that you don't go to your dentist to get your knee operated on. I had my knee replaced a couple of years ago, and I gained an inch in height, and it really screwed up my golf game. At least that's my excuse, okay? But I didn't go to my dentist to get my knee replaced because he has a medical degree, but he didn't know anything about orthopedics. All right. And yet people will go to friends, just because somebody's a lawyer in the church doesn't mean they're a business lawyer. And so you can go to somebody who's a good corporate lawyer but doesn't know anything about the faith. And so you end up with documents that don't have anything to do with what you're doing. You can go to a believer in the church who is well-meaning, but he doesn't know corporate law. And so you really need to make sure that you're picking the person who understands what they're doing, and find the experts to draft your documents. So the idea is incorporate. Pastor Allen was talking about their trustees. There's different words for the control groups, but many churches will have, the pastor is usually the president of the corporation, and he's going to wear both hats. He's going to be the shepherd. He's going to be the pastor, and the president. But not everybody underneath him has the same skill set. Some folks have a shepherd's heart, and they would make great elders. Other people have a real business gift, and they would make great directors or trustees. But it's important to identify who the players are. I was doing a due diligence with a church in Kansas, and usually, when I meet a new group, I'll meet with a control group, and we'll sit in a room, and I just want to know who the players are. So we're going around the boardroom, and we get to the treasurer, the comptroller, and a very unassuming middle-aged woman, very nice-looking lady. And she says, well, first of all, I just want to thank Pastor Jones for giving me this job since I got out of the penitentiary. Now, this is the treasurer, okay? And I'm looking around the room, and I'm thinking, this is a joke, right? Nobody's laughing. So after the meeting, I met with Pastor Jones. He said, brother, tell me about Sister Smith. He says, oh, yeah. She and her husband, they were convicted of racketeering and money laundering, but she didn't do it, and she was just an unwitting pawn. And I said, brother, you have your pastor's hat on, but you do not have your fiduciary hat on. As the CEO of the company, you cannot have a convicted felon as the trustee of your money. You cannot do that. And so again, the structure really matters, and so we were able to make a few adjustments in that church, and that worked out great. So anyway, we suggest incorporation. We urge you to do that because that's how you can actually protect, the assets of the church. And after a church is incorporated, then you can transfer the property from the unincorporated church to the incorporated church and enjoy the constitutional protection that are in your bylaws and your statement of faith. But one of the things about our soldier analogy is he's got multiple weapons. And I'm almost wrapped up, okay? Most churches are organized like the junk drawer in your house. Am I the only one that has a junk drawer, okay? You open the drawer, what do you get? Everything that's in there, right? Okay? And so, if a church is not thinking in terms of asset protection, then you're really operating under a very exposed type of an operation, because a bad day in the school or a bad day in the preschool or a bad day in in the outreach center can take down the entire operation. And so one of the things we do a lot across the country is we'll do asset protection, where you've got Church Inc., and now you've got these initiatives, and the initiatives have their own liabilities. So in Pastor Allen's example down here, for instance, a lot of times in a daycare or preschool, we were dropped down what's called a limited liability company. It only has one member, it's the church, and so it enjoys the church's 501c3 tax exempt status. And it is run by the board of directors, but appoints a manager over that LLC. And according to both corporate law and the IRS, you get the best of both worlds. So you get to be able to enjoy the tax exempt status of Church Inc. because you're doing church work. You're doing what the church has been designed to do: community work, education. That's a 501c3 activity. But what happens in there stays in there. So I had a church, they had a preschool, and one of the volunteers gave the wrong breast milk to a child. In that state, that's assault and battery. Okay? But thankfully, the preschool was an LLC that was connected to the church as properly, the way we did it. And so the LLC didn't have any assets. All it had was payroll. It was renting the space. There was a lease from Church Inc. to the daycare that protected them in that way. And so there was really nothing that could go wrong in that particular scenario. You always have insurance. I mean, it's not like you're trying to hurt people, but you're also, just because you want to have a daycare or you want to have a bus transportation ministry or you want to have a humanitarian outreach, you don't want to expose everything in the entire church, to that particular ministry or that outreach. And so you can wrap it in a limited liability company. That's not new law. It's been used in all 50 states. It's just a question of connecting things properly. So when you start getting heartburn over a particular initiative, think about wrapping it with a limited liability company. And I'm just dealing with a huge church in Florida right now, and they have real estate that's been given to them, and they have probably 50 apartments that they use for Southeastern students, and they rent them out. And I said, well, what do you think about maybe parking those 50 apartments? Let's have a property management group, and let's keep the property away from those students, and have a lease, from the property management group to those students. So if something happens, that's bad in one of those apartments, it doesn't take down all of this wonderful property God's given you. And so there's asset protection work you can do. There's structuring you can do. And so all of that's available once you incorporate. Think about key person life insurance for your pastors. We do a lot of succession planning. What happens if the pastor goes on a missions trip and doesn't come back? and he is the personality, if you would, the recognized leader, and a lot of people are giving because of him and coming because of him. Then there are insurance products that are available that can protect the church in those kind of moments. And one of the things you should have is it's officers and directors insurance. If somebody sues the church, or let's say they sue your preschool or your daycare or whatever you've got going on here, they're not going to, even if you have a limited liability company, they're going to name everybody. They're going to name the church, the pastor, the directors, the elders. And so if you have directors and officers insurance, which is just a rider on your hazard insurance, it's very inexpensive. But what this says is, if there's a suit against me as a director, officer of the church, the insurance company will prosecute that. they'll pay for the legal expenses. They'll take care of that matter. And you don't have to suck the tithes and offerings in the bank account from your church because there's been a suit or some kind of a frivolous suit. So anyway, just to finish up, I think in the book that the handbook I've given you, and please, take one of each, and you can go to the website. It's at the back of both books to order more. If you go to stephendlentz.com, rather than Amazon, you can get a group rate if you need to buy some for your leaders or whatever. But these are leadership books that both are practical, but are also very important. Alan was talking about protecting our hearts. I talk about the breastplate of righteousness in there. That, one of the things, the first thing that my guard put on me in South Lebanon was a flak jacket. What's the flak jacket supposed to protect? It's my heart. I can get wounded in a lot of places and still survive, but I'm not going to survive if somebody gets to my heart. And so there's a whole section in Bulletproof about protecting your heart and making sure that you don't let it get hard. Because, it's amazing. The church has such enormous capacity for good. It also has an enormous capacity to hurt people. And it's not unusual for people to come in your doors who have had church hurt, and you don't want them to get a hard heart. There's nothing good in the Bible that's said about a hard heart. Nothing. And so again, take please, as a gift from me, to please take it, and but if I can help you in any way, I'm president of the Christian Legal Society for Virginia Beach, and I've got a network of attorneys that I can access nationwide when it comes to church work. So if I'm not licensed in a particular state where you are, I've got somebody I can bring alongside so I can still be the architect and manage it and make sure it gets done right. So it would be my honor, my privilege. I love the local church. I think it's God's delivery system. He doesn't have a plan B. We're it, with all of our warts and all of our shortcomings. So it'd be my honor. So thank you very much.